Welcome to the Cinematologists, a podcast and film club for discerning cinephiles. I'm Dr. Dario, and with me as always is Dr. Neil Fox. So Neil, what have we got coming up on today's show?
Well, today we're going to be talking about Bronson, the Nicolas Winding Refn film, which we screened this week. And coming out of that screening, there's a number of things that we're going to be talking about. Masculinity, obviously.
Yeah.
Spectacle, violence, British cinema, the prison film. A lot of it ties in with an article that you've got coming out on British prison films called Punishing Bodies. What journal is that in?
That's in the Journal of British Film and Television. Shameless plug there. But yeah, it's. I think. I mean, we've sort of talked a little bit about the podcast and what we're going to do, and you know, when people have got stuff coming out, it's one of the things we're going to kind of try to disseminate our thoughts on people's research. And
yeah, hopefully people won't think it too, too self-aggrandizing.
No.
But I think it does lead to these kind of interesting, sort of timely, in an academic sense, kind of discussions. So,
sure.
And then we've got an interview with Dr. Johnny Walker from Northumbria University, who's talking about horror, contemporary British horror, and British cinema, and. And then and obviously the post-film discussion around Bronson, which I'm really looking forward to people hearing, because I think it was a really interesting discussion.
It went in ways that we kind of didn't expect, so it just shows how that your assertions about what a film might represent to a certain group of people, it might not necessarily chime with the actuality when it comes to discussing.
It was a really pleasant surprise in that case, in that sense. Yeah.
So we also want to just pick up, before we move on to our intro to Bronson and the screening, we want to pick up on our canon discussion, because obviously we gave our confessions as to the films that we had or hadn't seen, and I have seen 4 Bresson films.
Wow.
Which I think is pretty impressive, really.
That is good. Mark Jenks, who listens to the podcast and is
be very happy.
Here, he'll be happy with another Bresson mention.
Yeah, I mean, I was speaking about it with him, really. I was kind of really bowled over by how much the Bresson films sort of affected me. I mean, I saw Pickpocket, the Trial of Joan of Arc, The Devil Probably, which is a really sort of difficult film. Yeah. It's very nihilistic, and then L'Argent, which is final film. And one thing that kind of struck me is the sort of stripping back to minimalist kind of form that Bresson engages in, and the sort of this acting style, the deadpan delivery. And almost there's no characterization of people in the kind of traditional sense. The people, the characters in the films represent sort of concepts, I suppose. Whether it's sort of nihilism or redemption or regret or whatever it might be. And Bresson seems to cut through all the constructed direction to get to the elements of form and theme, I think.
Yeah. Wow.
So really interesting, and Jenks will be very happy that we're discussing Bresson again. So what have you seen then?
What have I seen? Well, I have started Neil's Year of Ozu in earnest.
Okay.
I rewatched Tokyo Story, and just to kind of to refamiliarise myself with the canonical film, and I liked it and I appreciated it, but it did feel very stiff, and it felt very awkward in places, and I just thought
But isn't that though a kind of mirroring the form is sort of mirroring the content of that family in
exactly,
a way, right?
and that's what I'm saying. It becomes really moving, and you realise that. The sheer kind of distance and awkwardness between all these characters, and this kind of layer of cruelty, which was present. So, but I did think, this could be kind of hard work. And then I also someone on Twitter who follows me, a guy named Lee, who's a big Ozu fan, was like, "Oh, you should watch all these other films," and he gave me a list, and on it was Floating Weeds, and I said, "I've got Floating Weeds to watch next," and when I watched it, and I was absolutely blown away. It's like 6 years after Tokyo Story, beautiful colour film. Right. I just found it so loose and refreshing, cruel but kind of sleazy, like Ozu's kind of letting his hair down almost.
Right, okay.
Nice kind of as close to farce as I guess
Ozu would get, which is sort of elemental compared to other directors.
But those themes of kind of cruelty and sort of intergenerational interplay are really to the fore, and just an absolutely kind of sumptuous film that I absolutely adored. So that was great, and now I'm kind of looking forward to to seeing more and seeing what else is on there. So
brilliant.
Just as another note as well, I thought what was interesting that came out of that was that this an engagement, particularly from kind of people who come to our podcast from the student body, with this idea of the great directors. One of our regulars, James, sort of asked, how do we kind of access that stuff you're talking about with it being everywhere. So I suggested Mubi as a good starting point, because of the kind of rolling films, and he's already kind of seen Varda. He's been introduced to Varda, and he's one better than me because he's seen Ali Fear It's the Soul by Fassbinder.
Right, you're just refusing, aren't you, when it comes to Fassbinder?
I don't think I can now. Okay. If the students are engaging it and kind of, I think I might have to kind of eat humble pie and go back. So.
I suggested to you Baal because I saw that at the Berlin Film Festival, which is a sort of, I think it's a Brecht adaptation, and that is strange.
Am I ready for that? If I haven't.
Well, it's interesting. What can I say? Our favourite word. That's interesting. Cool. So I mean, I think just going back on your point there, is I think what I did at film school was I had I don't know if you've seen that book, the 1,000 greatest international films. I think it was published back in the 80s or something like that. And at the back they've just got a list, and I sort of, I crossed them off as soon as I'd gone through them. I think that this is obviously we've got the resource of the library here, but libraries, general libraries, they haven't been closed down because of budget cuts. They still have those old films a lot because they all rely on donations. So there are places you can see it. And obviously, there's stuff online. I mean, Netflix and Amazon Prime, they could be better, I think, with the older films.
Yeah, but it's interesting because we sort of mentioned this idea of film education as a canon in itself, and there does seem to be a kind of, not a reluctance, but a kind of a lack of kind of just thinking basically like, well, what have we got here? We've built up this resource over years and years of films. Sure. It's a good starting point, and they've got the books there to kind of contextualize. So that was really encouraging that this, one of the students was like, actually, but then also watching, Varda and Fassbinder, I thought was exactly what you hope will come out of it.
It's taking the bull by the horns.
It is,
sure.
Diving in.
Okay, great. So we shall move now into our introductory section to our screening this week, which was Nick Winding Refn's Bronson. So let's listen to that now.
Good evening, welcome to the Cinematologists and tonight's screening of Nicolas Winding Refn's Bronson. Bronson was picked by Dario, so Dario, why did you pick Bronson?
Well, apart from the fact I just had an article out that I'd written about it, so sort of shameless dissemination of work as usual. I think it's an interesting film on quite a number of levels. First of all, I think it's an atypical example of the prison film, the genre of the prison film, which you can see examples of it in international cinema, American cinema, and British cinema. They all got particular aesthetic tropes and types. So I think it plays with the aesthetics of the prison itself as a space by which you can tell stories in, and plays with kind of narrative ideas and aesthetic ideas as well. And it's formalist rather than social realist, so a lot of the history of the British prison film has this kind of comment on what prisons are in UK society and this kind of thing. And it doesn't do that. It does something different. And in that sense, it uses the prison, I think, as an aesthetic canvas to kind of represent ideas about masculinity and violence and spectacle and celebrity. I mean, one of the key areas is the relationship between the glamorization of violence and whether, the sort of realist aspect of it. So is it criticising violence or is it enjoying the violence too much? There's that kind of contradiction going on. And it's just a really, really interesting film. And I think also it played, for some reason, it seems to play to this generation. We've talked a little bit about it being the kind of Clockwork Orange of the 21st century, whether that's true or not.
Yeah, I think we'll hopefully get into that later on, because I think, we are interested in why it has that kind of status, given the kind of the real complexity of issues within the film. You mentioned it there, and you write about it in the piece that you've written on it about the problems of kind of the prison space in terms of creating cinematic stories as a place where you can have empathy or kind of narrative sympathy or whatever. Yeah. But do you think that the fact that Bronson, as a real person, in a similar way to Bobby Sands in Hunger, which you also write about, we understand them as people, specifically through the prison. We don't really consider them outside of that context. It's all about that context. Do you think that helps when the filmmakers are going in to kind of make a film, because as people they're kind of synonymous with that space?
Well, I think it's definitely not a straight biopic. I don't think it aims at a sense of historical comment about how the prison system or prison in general affected Charles Bronson or who he was in regards to his crimes, I think. It's about how prison helped him create his own myth about himself.
it becomes more about, you know, how it punishes him as a matter of law, for example. So the aesthetics of the prison are kind of Bronson's construction. You see this in the film with the theatricality that sort of punctuates throughout. And he's kind of self-reflexively conversing on how he understands the prison space to be kind of integral to understanding his own identity. And in a way, there's a reading of the film that suggests that the whole of the aesthetic is a creation of his own mind's eye, in a way. And you can see it in the way that the light and shadow is used, that colour is used. And, you know, relating a little bit to what you talked about at just at the beginning of your question in terms of the prison space itself, or the idea of prison is very difficult to think about in sort of narrative terms. Film has to do something with the prison because, you know, the idea of a guy or whoever going into prison for 20 years, day in, day out, one day after another, you have to make that interesting narratively and dramatically. So, you know, this is a film that really does that on both narrative terms and aesthetic terms, I think.
We haven't sort of talked about this, but something like Starred Up, right, which is a good British movie.
Yeah.
What do you think is different in terms of the way it approaches, you know, the idea of the prison in this film to something like that, do you think?
Well, I think that definitely has a kind of historical British cinema relevance that relates back to earlier films like, say, Scum or something like that. Or even, I mean, it's interesting because I wrote a little bit about the idea of the way that we see prison films aesthetic or the prison aesthetically comes a lot from Porridge, you know, and there are examples of the history of the British prison film that you can sort of look to, but this is really sort of playing around with that. I think it's definitely more theatrical and experimentational. It's also surrealist rather than social realist or historicist in that sense, and it's definitely more kind of informed by Oh Lucky Man or Clockwork Orange, as I've said, and, you know, the only thing that's missing is a kind of Malcolm McDowell cameo, I think.
Yeah, because a friend of mine who's a listener to the show, Adam, for his MA, he wrote that Bronson is kind of he placed it in the lineage of Ken Russell, right, in this kind of Baroque masculinity, where it is this kind of interesting, almost heightened celebration and investigation of this kind of particular idea of man.
Yeah.
Do you see it in that kind of tradition of British cinema?
Absolutely, and I think it's even more than that. It's a kind of satire of the notion of the Victorian gentleman. So you've got that sort of vaudevillian aesthetic, the handlebar moustache, the bald head, but at any moment it's kind of ready to explode into this sort of extreme violence, and it's sort of maybe even a critique of the notion of sort of English imperialness or empire. That idea of, you know, the nation of England going off to other parts of the world and conquering, with this sort of very polite way of doing it. We're just coming through your country, don't mind us. This kind of stuff. So it's rooted in that idea of power and control and sort of English national identity, but very satirical about that, I think.
What do you think? What do you think Refn brings to it, being a kind of foreign filmmaker dealing with a very kind of British subject?
I think it's difficult to say, really. I mean, maybe there's that observational distance that somebody making a film, in a different nationality to the one that they come from is interesting. Like, so say there's lots of examples. I mean, Winterberger's just done Far from the Madding Crowd. So, and then you have Ang Lee who's done Sense and Sensibility. So there's lots of foreign filmmakers have come in and done English style films. But I wouldn't call this an example of a British film in a narrow sense. It definitely got the sort of European art house sensibility towards it. I mean, it's difficult to tell what a foreign director brings when they come in. I mean, I don't think there's any sort of influence of Denmark or anything like that, apart from the fact, I mean, it's very much his cold aesthetic is there, his presentation of violence, the interest in masculinity, I think, is definitely there, and it works on that kind of metaphorical level rather than a straight sort of realist level, and that relates very much to kind of film like Only God Forgives, of course, and Drive as well, I think.
Great. Well, we rattled through that, but I think we'll get on and watch it because we've got a nice audience, so I think we're going to have a lot to talk about afterwards. So let's settle in for Bronson. As always, you can hear what the audience thought of the film later on in the podcast, but now we're going to kind of open up the discussion and talk a little bit about prison movies and the British prison film in more general terms. And the article that you've written, Dario, kind of deals with a lot of really kind of, fascinating and interesting, which I know we use those words a lot, but it is sort of ideas around the prison as this kind of venue for film.
Yeah.
And I just sort of wondered if we could sort of start the conversation by talking about how the social order and constructs of the outside world are replicated or replaced in this very specific sort of venue that is the prison and everything.
I think I tried to kind of discuss the idea of what the prison does as a venue for cinema in terms of creating a kind of bounded aesthetics. And then once you get into... And obviously there's the sort of social construct of the prison, what the prison is there to do. It's there to punish. And I talk, I use a little bit of Foucault to talk about that idea of the way that prison is a kind of modern way in which the punishment of society has moved on from the kind of spectacles of torturing and hang-drawing and quartering and, from the early modern period. And then you move into modernity, and suddenly the prison as an institution becomes a way in which society can kind of deal with that level of criminality in what is supposedly a more humane way. So it's about the disciplining of bodies, the disciplining of time and space. But then when you get to a point where cinema comes along and tries to film that, it's really interesting because if somebody gets put away for 20 or 30 years. And the whole raison d'etre of the prison is to take away your liberty and take away your time and your freedom and your space. How do you condense all of that into a 2-hour narrative? And then how do you film the interior of the prison space and make it interesting? I mean, obviously there's lots of prison films that have basically replicated that kind of formalist aesthetic, so you get a sense in which everything is sort of at right angles and square, and shooting through bars is the obvious one. But Bronson, it kind of does something different. It goes into this formalist aesthetic, which, as I discussed there in the introduction, is kind of in the mind's eye of the prisoner itself.
Yeah, and also it brings the prisoner out of the prison, but not into the real world.
Yeah, that's right.
So into this kind of other space where the reality is kind of very blurry, which I think is really interesting. Because normally, it does. And even we sort of mentioned it in the discussion later after the screening. The outside world is not a real place.
No, it's not.
So
it's not.
The prison feels like the real place in this context.
I mean, I think that's what's interesting, particularly about Bronson, because it understands the boundaries of possibility that the kind of prison genre film and the prison as a space allows, and looks for ways to move outside that.
Yeah.
I mean, what's interesting, I think, about the sort of prison genre itself is you tend to get these archetypal characters. You've got the tough con, you've got the archetypal villain who oversees everything, controls everything. Then you've got the corrupt wardens and these kind of things, and then you've got the stories like the redemption stories or the escape stories or the wrongful imprisonment stories, these kind of things that happen time and time again. But one of the things I tried to talk about in my article was this transference of society from without to within. So you get this amplification of power that takes place. So the notions of violence and spectacle of masculinity, they're all there on the outside world, but suddenly they're bounded within this particular arena, and that allows them to be amplified and almost explored to their extreme capacity, I think.
Yeah, and it also, in that sense, that it's not being diluted by prison movie tropes.
No.
It's almost all bound up in this one figure that we spend the whole film with, which I think makes it really interesting. And you also, in the article, you talk about hunger as well, and all these kind of things you're talking about there. Kind of, I'm trying to work out, how does hunger deal with those things? Does it deal with those things? In what ways it's similar? So, what do you think are the differences between those two kind of very kind of sort of perennial contemporary British prison texts?
Yeah, I think that hunger is very much more about the social context of the IRI and Bobby Sands as a character in relationship to what his political stance was. But again, if you look at the second half of the film, that suddenly goes into like an exploration of the body and an exploration of masculinity through the body. And I think that the two films are very similar in that way, even though Hunger is aesthetically a very different film. It's much less stylized, overtly stylized in that way. I think it's a very directed film, let's say, and you've got those three sections, haven't you? So the beginning bit is showing the prisoners coming in and their treatment. It's almost trying to be a sort of observational documentary, but again dealing with the violence, and the violence is very much top down in Hunger. So the institution of the prison, you get those voiceovers from Margaret Thatcher. So it's constructing this idea of prison as an institutional tool of the state, which is acting on these prisoners, and the prisoners are using their bodies and their masculinity to dissent against that kind of political oppression. Yeah, and then Bronson is very different to Hunger, because I think he's much more psychological about the character himself, and these explosions of violence coming almost nihilistically from this sort of really charismatic central character. So they're similar in certain ways, but they're also very different. But I think that the kind of construction of masculinity through the body and through violence is the thing that kind of binds them together. And in a way, it's a thing that binds prison films as a genre together. And I know there are prison films that are about women prisoners and stuff. Yeah. But I think definitely the sort of the history of the prison film very much concentrates on masculinity.
Yeah, and what's interesting is I just think about in terms of space is just sort of trying to recall Hunger as a film I've seen a lot, but I don't want to be kind of like blanket sort of say this, but towards the second half of the film, it moves out of what are traditional prison spaces into that kind of. That obviously the famous long one take wide shot, which doesn't it could be anywhere, it could be in a community centre. Sure. Then obviously he moves into the hospital, and it does feel like there is the traditional kind of prison space and the traditional prison narrative, which seems so prevalent at the first half of the film, is there as this kind of memory of to move into something else. So it's interesting the way both films kind of play around with the space of what we expect, from...
I think it's one of the problems of kind of genre criticism, really. Like you could say, is there such a thing as the prison genre? Because it's bound up with the crime film and the action film, maybe. And most prison films are not set entirely in prison. No. They have sections that are in prison. But I mean, there are kind of examples. I mean, Startup, which I know you love, and I do like it in lots of. I think Jack O'Connell rises that film above looking a little bit like The Bill at times.
But then we also mentioned this, because it comes up later on in the discussion about the context of homosexuality in prison.
Yes,
and that was one of the things about Startup, which I absolutely loved, was the way it took that that expected. Oh, there's going to be this kind of homosexual relationship and this hierarchy of male relationships within the prisons, but it really naturalises them and kind of in such a really interesting and kind of quite powerful way, I think. And I think that's helped again by Ben Mendelsohn's performance.
Absolutely right. Absolutely
right. But I think Startup falls into that traditional narrative of the prison film, and we've sort of mentioned this as well about Bronson and Hunger. Are they kind of prison narratives, or are they art house films, which is looking at something else within the context of a prison, which I think is that thing about genre criticism.
It's much more the latter, I think. And I think placing them within again, which is what I've tried to do in the article, is say that they understand the generic conventions, the visual conventions that accompany a drama that's set in prison, but they're taking it elsewhere. They're not straight genre pieces like I think Startup actually is. Just going back to what you were saying about the trope of homosexuality. I mean, I think that the way I read the prison film is really it relates to this idea of the social construction of gender and sexuality. So, as soon as you change an environment, then suddenly the notion of sexuality and what is acceptable and what is not changes. So, the Ben Mendelsohn character in Startup, it's totally kind of, when his son comes in and he realises that he's in a relationship with another man, it's kind of like, well, what do you expect? I'm in this environment now where it's all men, and it's kind of like I am beholden to my environment. And it really sort of points to that idea of these things that we take for granted around identity and sexuality are very much constructed within the environmental context that we might find ourselves.
Yeah, great. I think that's it. I think we'll move on now to the to the interview, because I think just sort of talking about those kind of things about about genre and how we kind of how we relate to genre, and how a lot of it is constructed by things that we bring into genres. We're going to talk to Johnny Walker now about British contemporary horror and how a particular film kind of tries to address some of those kind of genre conventions.
Okay, let's listen to that.
I'm here with Dr. Johnny Walker from Northumbria University. Thanks for coming in, Johnny.
Thank you for having me, Neil.
You're here giving a lecture to our students on contemporary British horror, and you showed Doghouse, and I'm just wondering why you wanted our students to watch Doghouse.
Well, I mean, I guess there's a number of reasons. I wanted to, if I could capture the contemporary British horror film, which is a difficult thing to do because not one contemporary British horror film is the same. When we read in the history books and they talk about classic British horror cinema, everything seems to be quite homogenous and things are grouped together. Things have got sort of one universal generic style. And I thought that I would try to do something similar with contemporary British horror cinema, knowing full well, really, that the genre is a broad church and that would be difficult to do. So the reason I chose Doghouse was because, well, firstly, it's made by a director who's made a number of contemporary British horror films, Jake West. Secondly, because it's a film which is very much nostalgic in the way it sort of hat tips American and European horror films of the 1970s and 80s, which a lot of British horror films do. And thirdly, it's very much a film which engages with a lot of the male stereotypes that surround discourses of cult film fandom. So it's effectively a blanket film that covered a lot of key areas that I think are important to the study of contemporary British horror cinema.
Yeah, you were sort of talking to me earlier about it, and you mentioned that the way it sort of represents women and the kind of the role that women play in the film was quite interesting. Maybe you could just sort of talk a bit about that.
Yeah, I mean, it's quite a divisive film. When it was released, it was sort of dismissed out of hand as being sexist. Some of the male critics really liked it and said that this is a really underrated film. And I mean, when I first saw it, my reaction to it was quite negative, to be honest. But the more I thought about it, the more I thought, well, what this film is trying to do, at least, is to effectively self-reflexively poke fun at the audience that is likely to see the film, namely a concentrated male audience, fans of Danny Dyer, fans of director-D horror films, which typically are categorised as being male, in a certain kind of male, sexist, regressive, politically incorrect. And I think on that basis, Doghouse is quite an interesting, ironic, self-knowing character study of an assumed audience. And of course, Jake West, the filmmaker, is more than aware of the ways in which horror fans are stereotyped. And I think that in Doghouse, he's trying to destabilise, if you will, some of the common stereotypes that surround the discussion of, at least, of cult cinema and horror films as well. So
you think that is a kind of an awareness that the filmmaker has? It's not just something that is kind of imposed academically after the fact. That's actually kind of present in the kind of the process of the making of the film. Yeah, I think so. Yeah, totally. I mean, Jake West is a smart filmmaker. I've had a number of numerous discussions with him about his work, and he's a filmmaker that knows the genre very well, and by extension of that, he knows not only the audience but also the ways in which the audience has been stereotyped within and beyond academia. Yeah. So how does this film kind of relate to kind of writing about horror that's kind of that's kind of maybe kind of classical horror kind of theory and kind of classical horror cinema? How is it a film that is kind of engaged with both kind of horror theory and kind of horror cinema as a genre, do you think? Yeah, I do actually. I think that it's a film which engages with some of the common academic theoretical notions that have sort of explained away the pleasures of horror in the past. So I don't necessarily think that it's a film that's been written necessarily with academia in mind, but I do think that it's a film which responds to some of the stereotypes that academia has sort of has supported
for better or for worse. Well, for worse, to be fair, So it's very like there's a character in the film called Matt, who's a sort of a stereotypical nerd who's he's virginal, he's a male, obviously, and also it's got Danny Dyer in the film, who's known for playing a certain kind of role. So there are all of these sort of male stereotypes, men who typically have either poor relations with women. Or view women in a very negative light, or both. And it's a film which is very much about pitching a certain kind of man, or a certain kind of stereotypical version of a man, against a certain kind of stereotyped female, i.e. sort of, a cannibalistic, a feminist zombie cannibal, or something is what Danny Dyer's character refers to it. So it's deliberately, it's walking a dangerous line, perhaps, between between critique and misogyny, and it's playing with notions of gender essentialism, I think, quite in a sophisticated way. But that's not to say that everybody would necessarily respond to the film as I do.
Yeah. This is probably a question that is I probably know the answer to, because you've written a book which is coming out about this kind of period of British horror cinema. I just wondered, to what extent you consider this period a significant kind of part of the lineage of British horror, which is obviously kind of has kind of some really revered periods. Where do you think this period stands, in relation to some of those kind of famous sort of historical periods for British horror?
I mean, it's interesting that you say that. I mean, it's the films of the Hammer tradition from the 50s, 60s, and 70s are now looked back on with fondness, and we haven't really, with the exception of a film like The Woman in Black, which really is detached from the British horror film by and large these days. With the exception of that film, there haven't really been any sort of game-changing comparable successes to a film like The Curse of Frankenstein, for instance. Because when that film was released, it broke box office records. It was the first full-colour horror film. It was, genuinely speaking, a real game-changer. So people look back on that and say, yeah, The Curse of Frankenstein, what a game-changer. But we haven't really had anything that compares to that. We've had record breakers. The Woman in Black was the highest grossing, this is in quote marks, the highest grossing British horror film ever made.
Yeah.
But is it a game changer, or is it riding the coattails of a successful genre? I would argue that the latter, always. So the contemporary British horror film will always, I would argue, for better or for worse, sit in the shadow of Hammer, because, to be honest, I don't think there's been any sort of number one film that in the future historians will look at and say, yes, that movie. I mean, maybe something like 28 Days Later, but then again, that was a zombie movie, very much riding the coattails of the zombie film. It was shot on DV, so it was a bit like the Dogma 95 movement. It was the cinematographer was Anthony Dodmantle, who'd photographed Festin and all of those other films.
And was a Danish film school graduate as well.
Exactly. So you've got these, So you've got 28 Days Later, which I suppose is a benchmark film, but is it comparable to The Curse of Frankenstein in terms of its innovation? Probably not.
Okay. And so, what about Shaun of the Dead then? Because it's a film that kind of think that is going to pop up. It popped up today with the students. Because it's a film that film students love.
Yeah.
Where do you think that sits in terms? Obviously, not necessarily a game changer, but what do you think that its position is? In that kind of tradition.
I mean, Well, I think it's obviously a notable film, and I think Shaun of the Dead was released in an interesting time, because you had 28 Days Later, which in effect ushered in sort of like a zombie renaissance. I mean, there had been sort of more contemporary zombie quote unquote films before 28 Days Later, and I'm thinking of a film called I, Zombie, directed by Andrew Parkinson, but few people had seen that film. And 28 Days Later, in a sense, I guess, revalidated the zombie narrative as being something which could tell a contemporary story.
Yeah.
Because, I mean, it's a cliche, but Night of the Living Dead, Dawn of the Dead, and Day of the Dead were all seen to be films that were products of their time, politically engaged, but also, stories that people could relate to. Because I mean, I think one of the taglines for Shaun of the Dead was, ever get the feeling that you're surrounded by zombies? It's the idea that we can all relate to zombies in a certain way because, to quote George Romero, we're them and they're us. So Shaun of the Dead came out at an interesting time for horror cinema because things were starting to get very, very self-reflexive. The Dawn of the Dead remake came out either the same year or very soon after. So I think Shaun of the Dead is it's another benchmark film that inspired a number of other sort of horror comedies. But again, like all of the horror comedies that Shaun of the Dead inspired are very much of the sort of the lower ebbs of British horror production. And that's not to dismiss them, but that's to say that they're catering to a much smaller audience. So you had lesbian vampire killers. You had a number of other films that weren't horror films around about the same time as Shaun of the Dead that were using comedy duos like Magicians, for instance, the Mitchell and Webb film, which didn't do very well.
Yeah. That's not a film that gets bandied about very well.
Well, that's the thing, exactly. But it came out around about the same time as Shaun of the Dead. And clearly, you've got Mitchell and Webb, two very quote unquote British comedians. Maybe in the minds thinking in terms of the way that the producers of that film were thinking. Maybe we could capitalise on the success of Shaun of the Dead, by using two known comedians.
Yeah.
Obviously, clearly, in that respect, genre plays a big part in that. And I think that Shaun of the Dead, for being a zombie parody, that made it work for audiences that may not have seen it had it just been a sort of a straight romantic comedy, which it is at its core. There just happens to be zombies in it, So I think it's a notable film, but the impact that it's had on the horror genre outside of the zombie film has been relatively limited in terms of repeated box office success.
Great. Well, thank you very much for talking to us, and hope to see you soon.
Thank you very much, Neil, for inviting me. It's been a hoot.
I'm going to pick up a couple of things that Johnny was kind of talking about there. I mean, he was trying to make a defence of this film, Doghouse, which is, I know neither of us have seen that film, and it's not probably a film that we would have gone out and seen anyway. I mean,
we're not really the biggest horror fans.
No, not really. I mean, it's interesting. I wonder why that is. I mean, I do like the 70s horror films like Carrie and Rosemary's Baby. I'm really kind of into those. But I find this sort of contemporary horror scene very formulaic and just recycling of tropes all the time. But Johnny was making a kind of defence for contemporary horror, wasn't he?
Yeah, which made I think that's often common is that the film, you look on the surface of that film, and I think he sort of mentioned that particularly in the lecture that he gave about it's a Danny Dyer film, it's a Noel Clarke film.
Yeah.
So there's a certain expectation, and the film tries to undermine even the casting of those kind of actors. So I'm more interested in seeing it now. It's not a film that I would see, but I think like most kind of fans, we kind of need gatekeepers to kind of to highlight where films are doing things that are interesting or kind of trying to address these tropes. And I think Rosemary's Baby and Carrie are they're canon, aren't they?
They are now. Yeah,
so it's they're the films that and we can see in them, particularly those sort of films, the era that they we can look back and sort of see what they're saying about their era. Whereas I find contemporary British horror films kind of, I don't know how engaged they are, particularly with the era that they're in. A lot of them seem to be backward looking, sort of stylistically. So that's why sort of Johnny's ideas about what Doghouse was doing in terms of representations of women and kind of addressing masculinity was quite interesting. I thought.
I mean, I have seen quite a few Hammer films back in the day, but I have to confess, I sort of tended to watch those for like exploitatory reasons. Like, let's say, they're a bit sort of saucy when you're a young lad, as it were. And I just don't see how a kind of recycling or revisioning of Hammer in that form would ever play to a contemporary audience. So I don't know what this sort of recycling of horror through the Hammer brand, as it were, is going to bring.
Yeah, I mean, and Johnny's lecture was kind of fascinating. Talking about the woman in black, how, and I think it's, I think you couldn't, and he says that you couldn't remake those kind of films now as they were. They were very much of their time, in many ways. but yeah, so I kind of agree. I'm not sure what the what the goal would be there. But then I think that there are probably more interesting things going on than we, who aren't kind of engaged with that genre on a kind of really deep basis, would be able to tell. So.
Okay, interesting. So let's move on, and we'll listen now to our post-screening discussion of Bronson, which really sort of brought out some great discussion, I thought, from the audience. So let's listen to that.
So Neil, we'll start with you then, since I did all the answering of the questions in the first bit. So what did you make of that?
It was really nice to see it again on the big screen, and it's such a fascinating film. It really is. I mean, it's really conflicting, in terms of what Hardy manages to make you feel across the course of that film. I think is quite extraordinary. The sheer charm that he can kind of, but then the way it just kind of he can instantly flip it around, and you realise the situation that you're in. And I think Refn's very clever at kind of sort of drawing you more and more into that kind of world.
I mean, we did touch on the performance really, but I mean, it's up there, isn't it? Really, it's sort of physical transformation, but and it manages to sort of make you empathise with somebody that you shouldn't really be able to, and there's a sort of neutrality all the way through, because there's no motivation. No. You don't. Obviously, at the beginning, they sort of allude to, well, if it had gone at some point and said, oh, well, he had this terrible moment in his childhood that made it psychologically why he's like that. But there's none of that. So
no, it kind of preempts that right at the start and says, I had a perfectly reasonable childhood. Yeah. So whatever you think, whatever you want to attribute to it, you can't do that. You're not allowed to do that. So, but he is. You are fascinated with his motivation and trying to get some kind of idea of what is he thinking, what is he doing, and it is an amazing performance on that level. It's interesting to watch it as a Lutonian, I have to say.
Luton's where it's at.
Luton is where it's at. And the thing he says about Luton, that it never really changes, and that he knows Luton. It's he is such a fascinating figure for the town. He's always in the papers, but he's kind of mythological in the sense that no one really knows how long he was there or what his real relationship is. It's just he's just this kind of weird emblem of the town. So it's interesting, having not lived there now for a couple of years, to kind of to be drawn back into that was interesting.
And what did you make of the whole, the sort of notion I was alluding to before, that the prison space is a sort of construction of his own imagination in order that he can define himself in this specific way? I mean, if you think about the bit where he's in the asylum, that's the only place he can't take it, because he can't kind of be himself there.
But also in the real world as well. Yeah, that wonderful scene where at the party, it's so surreal. It's so kind of, so surreal that you just... that's the most uncomfortable you feel with him. The discomfort you get when he's inside is what's he going to do in terms of that violence. But you almost feel sorry for him in that scene, because it's like he's so far out of his element, and then when he's back inside, it's like that's where he belongs. But then you think, well, is that me kind of think? Is that us projecting onto him, or has he constructed this sense that he wants you to feel like, no, this is where I belong? It's so.
But and as well, back to the sort of motivation, he never wants anything either. It's like a classic moment where he says, right, you're going to give me what you want, and the warden says, well, what do you want? And he says, well, what have you got? Because he doesn't know what he wants. All he wants is the fights, the violence, the spectacle, the celebrity, the notoriety. Yeah,
and that kind of recalls the Brando in The Wild One. That kind of what have you got? That kind of idea of the rebel, that there is this kind of and that's a film as well which kind of takes the projection. And just kind of lives up to this kind of myth of what rebels and outlaws should do. So I think it's. I love the moment, that kind of real Kubrick moment early on with the music and with the sawn-off shotgun, where he's using it as a phallus, in a clear kind of Clockwork Orange homage. And there's lots of things like that where it's so aware of. This is how you're going to view this film.
And the bowler hat, which is Clockwork Orange, but also Magritte as well.
Indeed, yeah.
And then the whole last bit is a kind of whole performance art piece, really.
Yeah, and a really long amazing, and drawn out kind of, sort of performance art piece.
Shall we open it out?
Just as well, sorry, at the end, when he says, I think what I love about that end scene is that when he says he's had enough, it's almost like he knows that we've had enough.
Yeah.
It's like, okay, you spent enough time with me now, and I think if I spend any more time, it'll wear thin or you'll see through it. So he just resorts back to this kind of violence and says, he's had enough, get him out of here. And it almost feels like we're being let off, because I don't know what to think. It's
absolutely. So, does anybody want to make a comment? Anybody want to ask a question? Go ahead. Can we take the microphone round? Can somebody? Do you want to just pass it down? Thank you.
Yeah, I think. I guess this is probably just like one I'm probably going to start gushing on because Refn has become my new Kubrick. He's just my favorite director at the moment. But I've been researching about him recently, and I remember he was talking a bit about how one of his biggest mentors was Alejandro Jodorowsky. And when I was watching that final scene, especially where he kind of painted himself black and just the utter surreality of it, I kind of started wondering, is this some kind of reference to Jodorowsky's work? Because I kind of got this feeling that maybe this amount of surreality with like this whole idea of just like, I don't know, like Refn always seemed to be like that kind of person who would take massive LSD trips just to write a scene, like Jodorowsky did for a whole film. So I do wonder, is there a possibility that could be a reference? Because he's done that with one of his films, Only God Forgives. Like he dedicated it to Jodorowsky. So do you ever think that's a possibility with that last scene?
I don't know if it's a direct reference to anything Jodorowsky would have done. And I mean, in what you're talking about in terms of how scenes get written and that kind of thing, you know, I think these are things that will be very personal to the director. I mean, you can see that Refn is somebody who is sort of steeped in a history of cinema, and we talked about this over the weeks, haven't we? The great filmmakers. I mean, I don't know whether Refn is a great filmmaker, really. I mean, at this point, he's got a very specific style, I think. You know, he's interested in themes that you can see time and time again, you know, in his work. I don't know if he's particularly a broad filmmaker, and I don't know whether he's got a kind of social context. It's all very cinematic and cine-literate and aesthetic in that sense. But is there anything, you know, beyond that surface level in Refn's films? That's something that's open to question, I think. I mean, I don't know if you know, really, if this is saying anything particularly social or in depth, or is it more about the spectacle, this film, and all his films maybe?
Yeah, I mean, it feels like a film about performance and kind of, persona. But I think that if there is any kind of social context, it doesn't come from Refn, it comes from Bronson.
Yeah.
It comes from the person, which is, it's this very interesting character. That's where the layers are, and I think Refn's really interested in performance and and the idea of Bronson as a character. So yeah, I mean, it's the Jodorowsky thing. I don't know. I mean, he's clearly very, very conscious of kind of picking on certain references. So maybe, yeah.
And also, he's outside of this realist bent, isn't he? He's very much like you were saying. He's I don't think he goes as far as say he's a surrealist filmmaker, but he's not interested in the sort of realist continuity, filmmaking. He wants to sort of expand the worlds. Yeah, exactly. Anybody else want to?
Homosexuality seems to be a constant fixture in the film.
Okay. I
was wondering if you could maybe expand on its function in the story.
Is it homosexuality? Is it homosociality? Is it playing with that idea of what we're? I mean, there's that moment where he takes the librarian hostage, right? And then he takes all his clothes. And there's this moment I think, Mike, is he going to rape this guy? And then there's the. I think there's a direct reference to the film Woman in Love, where there's the Oliver Reed and Alan Bates wrestling in front of the fire. So it's playing with this idea of sort of elemental masculinity. But I think there's a satire there as well, with the full frontal nudity is kind of definitely alluding to the fact, that the power isn't retained in the penis, it's retained in the phallus. It's symbolic. Do you see what I mean? And it's making a satire of all of that kind of stuff, I think.
And also the homosexual characters that are alluded to throughout, Uncle Jack.
Yeah.
But then Uncle Jack's sexuality, is it homosexuality, or is he, kind of bisexual because of the nature of that house? And obviously the guy who kind of organises the fights, there's an expectation that it will be commented on through Bronson, I think, through being a prisoner and the kind of the connotations of being a prisoner, but it never really gets there. You know, there's no kind of consummation or kind of rejection of it. It's just, it's like everything. You have to project how does this character relate to, you know, to these other characters in that way.
You're not giving the answer to the question, really. Yeah. You know, it's all kind of like held back, and you have to infer onto it again, which is sort of very, very key to Refn's films.
And there is very little homosexuality in the prison, which is where in a prison film you kind of expect it to be. It's kind of external to that, which I think is one of the most interesting things about it.
Yeah, for sure. Luca, do you want to pass that down?
Following on from that, while I kind of get what you mean when saying this, like homosexuality is a feature within prison, I saw it as more like a primal kind of like instinct for him to take off his clothes. I mean, when you've seen it in Startup, when he takes off his clothes and buzzes himself up, is easier so he doesn't get held down by the security guards. But it also adds to the primal nature of Bronson's character, for the fact is that he's kind of like reverting back to this state where he is the strongest within society because he can fight the hardest, and he's known for that.
Yeah.
So in that sense, that's how I see it. It's less about homosexuality, it's more just about the primal nature of man as they can fight back.
I think that's absolutely right, and I think it also relates to this idea, you know, of when somebody is taken into prison, they're deprived of all the cultural markers that give them their identity, and he's taking that one step further, you know, getting rid of all the clothes, and it's just who I am is this fundamental, you know, sort of barbaric, violent, you know, person. I think so. I definitely think that's a good way of reading it. Paul.
Kind of leads on again from like the homosexuality thing. But do you think the director, because it's quite aimed at a male audience, his films, do you think like he kind of turns male kind of dark fantasies into fetishisms with like themes of homosexuality, violence, like individual like kind of hero cult figure in themselves? Like, do you think that's something that's, you know, made on
I think
purpose?
he's definitely playing around with all of that stuff.
Yeah, I think if you kind of take Drive out of the equation, you know, in terms of that kind of run, you know, and look at Only God Forgives, he's definitely trying to undermine that kind of male stereotype, you know, and almost kind of prod the audience into feeling uncomfortable and sort of bringing to the surface certain kind of underlying tensions around homoeroticism and homosexuality.
Well, I think in mainstream cinema, what you're getting at is in mainstream cinema, there are specific narrative and aesthetic ways in which men can get undressed, and the audience is allowed to watch them, or the policing of how they are watched. So it's, you know, it's violence, and there's always a woman in the picture to kind of make sure we all realise that the star is straight, that kind of thing. But this is kind of not going on here. So it's sort of asking if it is intended for a male audience, which I think you could argue it is. It's asking the male audience to have to watch in a certain kind of way, or playing with the idea of how a male audience may be watching. I mean, I don't know. Do people think it's definitely aimed at a male audience? I don't think it's difficult to say.
Well, there are quite a few. Yeah, there's quite a few women here, so. You know, why are you here? You know, in a real, you know, what do you get from the film? You know, apart from Tom Hardy, I guess is the.
I don't want to pick out any of the women in the audience unless they want to speak.
That's true. Yeah, it was more of a rhetorical question rather than a kind of picking people out.
Any other comments? Oh, right, there we go. Fantastic.
What I find from my kind of experience of violence in films, if I kind of compare it with, you know, Meadows or Considine, and then there's Tarantino. Don't know why I put the mic over there. You know, with Tarantino, it's the comedy aspect. It's he's, you know, being very defensive against talking about violence. He's skirting over it and using comedy as a kind of blanket over it. And then you get kind of Meadows, who's like, well, this is history, this is visceral. Whereas with Refn, and this is why I'm probably defending the woman audience with it, it's sexual. It's something that's, I mean, even Refn himself said he's aroused by blood, he's aroused by violence. Right. And I respect the kind of openness with it, the fact that he does have these dark fantasies and he does tell people about it, whereas you know, Tarantino has a go at Christian Guru Murphy and goes, I'm not going to talk about violence. But yeah, Bronson is a very masculine film, but I think it does appeal to females in a way that it's not, you know, patriarchal, it's not doing anything to women, but I find it so, like, sexual. Not saying I'm turned on or anything, but I can imagine how people can, and I can imagine why.
That's a great point what you're making there. But do you think that he's kind of like saying that to the audience, that he's not saying maybe he's saying a little bit about himself, and this is, you know, tying up the connection between violence and sex, for example, is part of the human condition maybe, and sort of saying, you know, this is the dark side of sexuality and violence, and these things are interrelated maybe. Yeah,
I think it's just, I respect him so much because it's very true and very kind of, even though he does present it in somewhat of a kind of surreal way, it's just being able to put all these kind of dark fantasies onto a canvas and use all production techniques, all kind of perfectly fits into it with the kind of the mixture of like classical music, which you kind of associate with, you know, Clockwork Orange, but then you've got kind of electro music, which kind of gives it a more like metallic sexuality, and then
the Pet Shop Boys as well.
Pet Shop Boys, that's a perfect scene. But it's just, yeah, I respect it so much because it's a new way of seeing it, just this sexualized, and it's like you're not meant to really like Bronson, but you kind of, it's like that impressionable thing. It's like when Tarantino gets asked about people, like, you know, going and shooting people and how it can impress audiences, but it's like with this, it's like you kind of respect Bronson sometimes because it's just that masculinity and sexuality, and I'm separating Tom Hardy from this, but it's just... Yeah,
it's not cartoon in the way that Tarantino is.
Yeah.
It's undercut.
Yeah. Yeah, it's definitely undercut, yeah. Because the violence is so real and so, you know...
but you don't get the diegetic sound. You know, there's not a lot of, you know, the actual sounds of punching. At various points there is, but most of the time it is taken out, and then the non-diegetic, you know, it's the classical music, the sort of, which is the Clockwork Orange kind of style over the top of it, I think, which is really interesting.
You get more kind of visceral kind of effect from just Hardy's breathing in it. That's something that strikes more fear into me than the violence itself, because that's, you know, the violence, you know it's happening, but him breathing, you don't know what's going through his head, and you have to kind of judge on the rhythm of it and stuff.
Absolutely. Is there anybody seen this for the first time? Is this anybody want to say something? Michael, do you want to say something? You've always got a good comment to...
Andrew's got...
Andrew...
yeah.
Sorry, either way, it's fine.
It felt a bit exploitative, to be honest.
Right.
It seemed to me to be taking this person who is, in the grand scheme of things, completely powerless. He's kind of at the bottom of the social ladder, and holding him up, using him in a sort of clown-like way to offer an outlet to people to, you know, explore their own repressed fantasies or their own insecurities about masculinity or whatever.
Sure.
And particularly given that it's about a real person, that did seem a bit ethically dubious to me. I don't know if you'd agree with that.
No, that's an interesting point, because it's like, is it just adding to a kind of mythology around kind of violence and criminality that it doesn't actually possess or deserve? I suppose it's an interesting point. I mean, are you talking as well about the moments of theatricality, the director dress, the sort of theatre bits, the face painting, all of that stuff?
I mean, yes, that. I think that kind of makes the problem slightly worse, in that kind of really emphasises the fact that this is all a performance. And it seems like this person is a real person. Yes, you can look at what he's done and say, oh, it's all a performance. You don't actually know that. And to take his story and turn it into that in a film in a way which is, it does glamorize, it does make you want to, it does try at times to make you like him and sympathise with the things he's done, and yes, it just seems like it's using the real person as a tool to do something which is questionable.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is an interesting point. I mean, it's weird because when I watch it, it's kind of I don't know the person, but seen that face in the local paper a lot, making that face, and always presenting himself from behind bars in that way, and even I think there is an audio of him. He saw the film and at the premiere or something. There's he kind of he's made himself part of this narrative of the film. And that's what I think is interesting is I don't know whether that's just that he's happy with the film, he thinks it's a fair representation, or he's just so far along with his own mythology that he's just going to go along with it, because to contradict it would be kind of pointless now, I think.
I think the other thing to say as well is that is the film sort of saying that any historical representation is a construction? It's just maybe if it's using what you might or anybody might regard as a historical realist way of shooting, then suddenly then does that have more authenticity than this? Is that just as mythological? It just uses the tropes that we're used to seeing, that would seem to kind of guarantee that this has got a truth to it. This has got a realism to it. Whereas here it's eschewing all of that. So, and saying no, here is the mythology of this person, and therefore, kind of history on film is kind of like that. It's just like that anyway, because it's all a representation. I don't know,
And that's what I think. That's what I was sort of trying to say at the start. It's why it's a very complicated film, I think, because it's very problematic in the way it presents this person, but it gives you no other context other than incarceration, pretty much, and everything outside of the incarceration is more surreal and more theatrical than the stuff inside, almost. So it's a very difficult film to read, I think. So and I think exploitative is a good way of kind of talking about it, because it's valid. Yeah.
Anybody else want to add something? James, did you? Oh, Andrew was first. Go ahead, and then we'll come to James. It's okay. It's working.
Yeah. Don't really have too much to say about the film. So, the first time I've viewed it, I just felt personally that the film kind of missed the mark for me. I felt like the story was sort of lacking in a sense. There wasn't a resolution in the end, and it was very repetitive. And I mean, the character, you saw his sort of hard side the entire time, but you didn't really get to see his soft sort of side very much. And I thought it was visually very well shot. And I kind of felt a disconnect from the character. I don't know if that's a good or a bad thing.
I don't worry too much about that.
he didn't feel like he didn't feel like a real human being anymore. Just felt like this prisoner. You can't really connect with the guy. I don't know if that was the purpose so much.
Sorry.
Yeah.
No, I was just going to say. I think actually, that you can read. I think what you're saying ties into a lot of the stuff that we've been saying already, but you can read it in a different way, I suppose. So, like the resolution stuff, I think that's kind of the point, really. I think that's totally intentional. And the empathy thing, I think there's this sort of neutral construction. This idea of he's not a real person. No, he's a myth. He's a construction in and of himself, or he's being constructed from the outside. I don't think he's meant to be presented in that sort of realist way.
No, certainly not. You know from the start that this is not going to be a presentation of a real, in a realistic sense. Yeah. And the resolution is that it's still ongoing. He was sentenced again for another assault last year. So that's when you realise that it is a real thing. And in terms of the soft side, I think that is saying something in itself, that there is this, where is it that you would expect to see light and shade in a person, and it feels like there is no shade. It's just pure aggression.
This is just the one moment where the the sort of the artist teacher sort of says, find the bit that doesn't belong in here, and that's the only little glimmer that you get, and then it gets thrown back in his face by the warden who doesn't want to look at the picture.
But then that's when it feels to me like a normal narrative.
Yeah, you know,
where he kind of sees this glimmer of light, and then we're going to take the program away. You know, and that's when it feels, you know, so that's when I'm glad the film ends, really, because I think it kind of dips into tropes from another kind, from a more traditional kind of prison film or kind of social comment film.
James,
maybe if I could just make one last point.
Sure.
I just sort of felt that the film was it was difficult to enjoy, and I'm not sure if you're supposed to enjoy a film like that. You're just supposed to sort of embrace it. I don't know, which is kind of strange, because when I go to watch a film, I want to be able to sort of enjoy, get into the film, and I felt so disconnected.
Right.
Yeah, last
point. James?
While the mic's going down, I think Refn will be quite pleased if that was... I think that's one of his intentions, is to make people uncomfortable and question what their relationship with the film. He's very provocative in that sense, I think. So.
Yeah, my point is similar to Andrew's. I feel like I never got on board with Bronson's character. He was just, for me, he was completely unlikable. And I was trying to think of other films where they put like an the antagonist character and they make him centre stage. And I was thinking of like Goodfellas, like Robert De Niro's character in Heat. And with those characters, you seem to really get on board with what they're about. But with this one, there was just a complete disconnection. I just wondered what your opinion on that was, or if anybody else felt the same.
Well, I think what the film does, what those other films don't do, is that those films hide the violence of the characters below existentialism or charm or all these things. You know, these kind of cultural things. And what Bronson does is it reminds you that, you know, that for people in that situation, a lot of the time the violence is the thing, and it puts it centre stage, and it makes you kind of find the character after the violence. So I think it does flip it around. I mean, it's interesting because we were talking about this the other day in terms of it's a film that generationally people kind of love and think it's great and think it's cool and think it's fun, in the same way that people thought Scarface with Al Pacino is that same kind of film that, you know, and it's clearly not a film that glamorizes violence or celebrates violence or anything.
I think it's trying to do what Kubrick did in Clockwork Orange. So if you think about that film at the beginning, it takes this absolutely repulsive character that you absolutely hate, you know, nonsensical violence, raping people, all this kind of stuff. Then turns the tables on the audience by putting him in a situation where he is being controlled, you know, and he has the Ludovico test and all that kind of stuff. And you feel empathy for this character that you absolutely should, you know, abhor, really. And I think, in a sense, it's trying to do a similar thing. But I think it's less clear cut in this film than it is in Clockwork Orange.
I think it's really funny. This film. I think some of the comic timing that Hardy has is, right. And that makes it more uncomfortable because he's funny, you know, and he makes you laugh, and it's, you know, it's awkward, and I know that's subjective. It's not that everyone will find it funny, but I think it's.
I think sometimes we talk too much about empathy with the character. I don't empathise at all with the character at all, but I'm on board with it. If you want to use that terminology that you used, I want to know about this character, and when the theatrical bits come in, you know, it gives you a sort of insight into this sort of flawed psychology or sort of really strange, you know, way of thinking, and it's never, and like Andrew says, it's never really resolved. So he's going against what the mainstream expectation would be of an audience in lots of different kinds of ways, and you know, I suppose that's what people find difficult to deal with.
Yeah, and I think it's almost asking whether you think that almost kind of framing characters like this in this way is a good and acceptable thing to do, and if it's not, then I think that's fine. And if you come away thinking this is not the way stories like this should be told, that's kind of a good thing. But because I think that a lot of it is reminding us that, you know, not just films, but kind of society does elevate people and frame people in this way, and we forget the reality of the violence that they commit or the kind of the acts that they do. So I think it's almost a moral question that it's posing.
I mean, yeah, exactly. And like, think, how many people does Uma Thurman kill in Kill Bill? How many people does he kill in this film? None. Doesn't kill anyone. But, you know, you could argue that this is a more repulsive character. So it's just the way that cinema is acting upon you, I suppose. Okay, I think we've... oh, sorry, one more, Paul. Go ahead. Well, last comment, and then we'll...
Kind of leading on from you saying whether you think it works as a film or not, and kind of Michael saying if he was an exploited character. Like, I guess the film it closely resembles to, like, iconography-wise, is like Chopper Reed.
Yeah.
Seen it?
Yeah.
So it's just like, whereas Chopper Reed's like personality in real life, like no one really knew how much of his story was true. He kind of wrote a load of books and kind of fabricated a lot of it, whereas Bronson's was really well documented. So, and again, Chopper had a beginning and an end, whereas Bronson just kind of doesn't. So do you think it works better as a narrative for a film to kind of have a story of this, this brute, and kind of have a beginning and an end, and kind of fabricate bits in the middle to make a whole story? Or do you think it works better to kind of exploit Bronson's character just to kind of make a purely art film?
It depends how you define works better.
I think you kind of hit the nub on the head there, where you've separated a narrative kind of experience and an art house experience, and I think that there's a lot in this film which blurs those lines, but essentially it almost is an art film. It's a performance piece about a character with it works better is kind of going to be subjective, but I think that there is, the more you kind of deconstruct it, the more you think actually maybe that all our expectations of what this story should be or could be are not what the film is trying to do at all.
I mean, if you think of prison genres, there's the redemption story, there's the false imprisonment story. There's off the top of my head, I've written about them, but there's different sort of elements of that you see in prison. This is kind of social commentary on what prison does to society. That kind of none of that is here. It is sort of taking it out of that kind of narrative expectation or generic expectation and playing with these ideas in an art house sense, I think.
I think the more you talk about that, the more the film probably falls apart in terms of being anything really solid, and becomes much more fluid. And I think that when I was watching it, then I was thinking, it shifts in tone, or it feels much more urgent and kind of questioning than actually a kind of solid, coherent piece of work.
Sure, absolutely.
And the only thing that ties it together is Hardy. He's the constant.
Yeah.
Everything else around.
I think that's in a way that could be the only reason it works. If you didn't have such a great performance, or a performance that manages to pull off something that's very difficult, then it may be a film that would just have been lost completely. Apart from that,
but we need it because it talks about Luton. So
that's right. Puts Luton on the map.
It does. Well, yeah.
Okay, so we'll call it a night. Thank you very much indeed for coming, and we'd look forward to seeing you next week, hopefully, for Goodbye Dragon Inn. So thanks again.
First of all, a couple of apologies after that discussion. I know that Luton isn't only known for Charles Bronson.
Thank you, as a Lutonian. And also, my apology is that I know that there are reasons that women would watch this film and not just for Tom Hardy. That was trying to make light of what I kind of just instantly perceived as quite a tense room when I asked what I hoped would be a rhetorical question.
But then you had a great discussion on Twitter, didn't you, with one of our students about kind of the aspect of gender and why men and women would be automatically separated out on gender lines as to why they would watch a film.
Yeah, so I think that did lead to a really... So the question itself was I think a valid and sort of engaging one.
Yeah.
But my quip about only watching for Tom Hardy was completely.
But it's
inappropriate.
It's an interesting point because actually Tom Hardy is not constructed as a sexual object in the traditional sense of that word within Bronson. I think.
No, totally. And I think even Tom Hardy as this kind of male star is almost a throwback to these kind of quiet, sullen, physical stars of which just like Robert Mitchum, Steve McQueen. In ways that a lot of modern stars just aren't, No. So I know. Yeah. So okay, apologies done.
Right. Move on.
But it did. Both of those have led to kind of us having conversations about Luton and on Twitter about the kind of the male gaze and the sort of a female audience's place in that. So the discussion was surprising, wasn't it? In terms of we had an expectation that this film is this kind of cultish, very kind of fanboyish kind of film, and most of the conversation was not in that area.
No, I mean, I just thought that this was a sort of modern classic for in a way, young male cineasts, which, let's be honest, is the 2/3 of our audience probably would be in that category if we're taxonomizing in that way. But yeah, and also it led to that notion of where Refn sits as a director. I mean, obviously, sort of Drive is this big film that everybody kind of points to, and I mean, it's his most mainstream film, I think. I mean, I do love Only God Forgives, and I think that it's interesting, sort of relating back to the Bresson discussion. He's very much a director of cinema. You know what I mean? His films are cinematic in terms of their exploration of the form of cinema, I think, rather than just sort of being realist narrative, continuity stories.
But the discussion, I think, if we're looking at what you sort of said about Bresson earlier in terms of these elemental kind of thematic ideas which are represented in character, it was very difficult to really pinpoint what Refn or even Bronson is kind of saying in a kind of fundamental, elemental sense. It seems to be trying to do a lot of different things. And I thought it was interesting to go back to what Johnny was saying about Shaun of the Dead is this film which we have this idea that, everyone thinks of it in a certain way. And it's, but he was saying that despite being a big popular film which, young male cineasts love, it's not a game changer in the sense of even like something like Curse of Frankenstein. So, these are films which attract fandom, but critically they are.
And this is not Bronson's not a game changer in the way that Clockwork Orange is. Nowhere near. No. But is that more to do with cinema than the films themselves? So we've talked about it. We're probably going to have to do one podcast entirely on this, where cinema's kind of position is in contemporary culture in comparison with internet, video gaming, TV.
I think we're going to talk about that next week when we talk about Goodbye Dragon Inn, which is very much about the death of the cinematic experience and what that means for cinema as an art form and as a thing. So.
And I think some of the comments that came out of that post discussion there as well were that some of the criticism of the film that were sort of alluding to the fact that it doesn't have narrative corners, it doesn't have closure, beginning or an end in that way, that it doesn't flow in a linear sense, which is coming from an audience that have grown up on sort of long form narrative television and mainstream, overtly sort of mainstream film. I think.
But also, what's interesting is that something like Hunger doesn't really incorporate many traditional cinematic kind of illusions, whereas Bronson is all about we talk about the Brando. He takes a lot from narrative, even like Clockwork Orange is a narrative in a much more traditional sense, in terms of a character's arc. If we're going to be kind of,
it's interesting because I would say that Hunger is stylistically directed. I don't think it's flamboyant.
No. But what I mean is, it's like there's not much in there that people can go, that's from this kind of Hollywood movie.
That's right. It's not reflexive in that
exactly.
In that sense, I think.
So,
for sure.
And I think that when you're watching a film which has a lot of reflexivity, you're kind of almost expecting the typical characters and sort of narrative structure to appear, and that's what's missing. Which I think maybe what kind of some of our audience kind of were struggling with was, well, I recognise a lot of this stuff, but the character arcs and all that, that's not present. So I think it's. But then we sort of talked about Refn being. He's definitely provocative. Even if at the moment it's hard to say what his kind of ultimate cinematic legacy will be.
Yeah, absolutely. So that leads us on to what we're going to look at next week. So it's your choice next week.
It is. We're looking at Ming Liang Tsai's Goodbye Dragon Inn, also known as Busan, which is a wonderful film about the last day of a kind of old cinema in China. So.
Right. So that's going to lead into that discussion about where cinema is, I think, for sure.
Yeah.
Cool. So, The Cinematologists is recorded in front of a cinema audience. It is produced by James Chatwin, Marcus Thorne and Michael Tibbins, and the design and branding is courtesy of Philly Blumel. The title music is by Nine Inch Nails, and the segue music is by Moby. You can find information on screenings, music licenses and archived episodes at cinematologists.com. Follow us on Twitter at Cinematologists and on Facebook at facebook.com/cinematologists. Thanks also to our guests and to our live audience. Until next time, this has been the Cinematologists Podcast. Thanks for listening.